A lot of stuff you can do in Geometry Dash. Main levels, custom levels, map packs, gauntlets, star grinding, key collecting, chest opening, demon grinding, user coin grinding, orb farming, and more. Over the first 5 years of Geometry Dash, there have been a lot of efforts to push for new content and provide with new possibilities for the community for what they can play and make. Some of these things don't actually ever make it into the game though. There are a couple of additions that, for better or worse, were scrapped or never implemented. This video will try to cover the most of them and showcase them in the game as they probably would have been implemented if they weren't scrapped. We'll start off with some of the earliest scrapped content. Before the game was released, there were some art changes that took place involving the difficulty icons. Back in this time, the demon and auto rating didn't exist yet, so there are only these 5 that can be demonstrated. Unlike the difficulty icons that ended up taking their place, these have no shading and have one plain color scheme to them. In terms of design, it was definitely better that they were replaced since the icons are very plain, and despite it being pretty obvious out of these 5 icons which is the hardest difficulty, to have the faces now follow a pattern in terms of facial expression is a rather inconsistent design choice, hence the difficulty icons that took their place did this better. One thing I think could have stayed though was the original color scheme, since that followed a cohesion more than the others. It would have kept the pattern for facial expressions alongside color pattern, which would have been even better. But that was not to happen, and in the end, these original difficulty icons never made it into the game. But usually they're just different versions of existing icons that has been slightly updated for better visuals. There are a few unique instances where they had their appearances altered though, such as the first UFO and ball icon in the game. The ball was improved by a pretty big margin, actually having a form of internal design and doesn't appear as trippy as the predecessor. The UFO on the other hand went through a few different design approaches. Can't say I know the reason behind these changes other than finding a visual aspect that RobTop was pleased with, and in the end, I would agree with his decision to use the final version since it is the best out of the 3. The final 2 player icons I would like to discuss are these 2 different versions of the default ship. They have a lot of indentations that the original version of the ship doesn't have, and it is rather confusing what the intent of these 2 ships was supposed to be. Whether it was meant to be the original ship icon or an unlockable ship icon alongside the original is unknown. For one reason or another, they never made it into the game. Many of the icons that would be going through changes afterwards would only be getting minor ones, shown as examples on these promotional images of upcoming updates. As it stands, these are the majority of unused player icons. Now, let's talk about some unused block designs. Much like the default player and difficulty icons, the default block also underwent some changes before the game was released. The beta version of the default block was more akin to how the block object in the Impossible game looked like, just not in the black color. The release version improved on this design by giving the inside of the block a gradient texture and a soft glow surrounding the block. Another block that received a small change were these 1.7 blocks. These are a combination of 2 different blocks that in this image was a slightly different texture on the second block, which doesn't really have that much to be said about it. Same can be said about this slope, where there's an object outline surrounding the entire slope here, but this object does not exist in any released update. Yet another block design that does exist in the game but was slightly altered are these. These blocks do exist in game but have been given a pixelated texture filter and softly shaded edges. Personally, I prefer the older version of these, but I wouldn't mind having both versions available in the game. It's definitely a preference thing. Surprisingly though, there are also 2 entirely unused set of blocks perfectly fit to be implemented into the game. This set of block design here was very likely made before the game came out, but it was never implemented. It is the first piece of unused content that I failed to see why it was scrapped. It is fully usable, no textures or clipping, and it would provide with some nice contrast compared to the other block designs that existed at the time. A theory could be that it was scrapped simply because of how much it deviates from the other block designs in terms of texture, but other than that, it's odd to see these remain unused all these years. The other unused block design was meant to be released with the 2.0 update, which seems to have been interactable platforms. They were ready to use and everything, but they were just never added to the 2.0 update. Much like the block design previously, I fail to understand why they were excluded from the game, and I don't have any potential or logical theories as to why this happened. Only RobTop himself can answer why this was done. That covers all the unused or changed block designs, so let's move on to the next aspect, gameplay related content. The gravity portals and potentially game mode portals had a different design before the game was released, which was more basic in design and you were not able to see through it. I definitely find the original design to be worse in this case since it is very limited, and it is also difficult making this look like the player icons actually entering the portal, so this change is definitely for the better. There are also unused orb designs, but I really have no clue what the purpose was by having 3 different designs. Maybe it was to signify that it was a deadly orb if you interacted with it in a specific way, but I can only theorize. Given that this image seems to be from the 1.6 era of the community, I am really confused what the purpose of the green orbs was. None of these designs ended up being used regardless, and once more, only Rubtop can explain what the purpose of these was meant to be. There were also some minor differences with the 2.0 features user coins and teleport portals, but they aren't particularly significant. The user coin used to have a more blue color, and the portals used to be smaller in width. Nothing too significant, but worthy of a small mention here. Now onto the hazards. We begin with a hazard that is pretty much a carbon copy of the grounded hazard in the Impossible game. Excluding the fact that it is ripped from a different game, I fail to see why this was excluded. Sure, you can create this obstacle to some extent if you hide the top of this object, but it would still be nice to have this readily available too. Majority of spike designs remain the same from when they were previewed to release, but there is one that had their texture slightly changed. This spike from 1.7, which before release had a different texture with a darker spike texture on top of it. This spike did come out in the 1.7 update, but it was only a plain color upon release. Surprisingly, the most unused type of object that I have seen during the research are buzzsaws. There are many designs that were created but just never used, and this goes back all the way to when they were originally introduced. Starting off with this that never got implemented into the game, which personally I'd say is for the better since it genuinely is really ugly and looks like the Red Hot Chili Peppers logo. I can definitely commend the attempt though. Conceptually it is a rather interesting design, but in the end I believe that it is for the better that it wasn't kept. Next up is a thinner version of an existing buzzsaw along with a unique design of the same buzzsaw that was never implemented. I have to say that this buzzsaw genuinely looks more vicious than the versions that were released, and the second design with the holes is an interesting design choice, but the latter was never implemented into the game for unknown reasons. Another set of buzzsaws that have seen change in design are the ones from the 1.8 update, where originally they had a much blockier design. I would assume that the reason these were not implemented was because of them being in the shape of a pentagon, as opposed to what the logo name implies, hexagon force. Still though, I do find it rather confusing why these were cut from the game. The versions of this buzzsaw that we ended up getting are not bad either, but it would have been nice to have both versions available to us. And finally, probably one of the reasons some of you even clicked on this video, the skull hazard. There are many different versions of this skull. There's one in the black color with spikes, there's one without spikes, there's one with only white outlines, there's one with a blue and glowy outline, and in many different sizes. This is before the option to scale existed, so before the 2.0 update, this is without a doubt the most contrarian design choice in the entire game. I assume this worked very similarly to how a buzzsaw functions, with the exception that this skull probably does not move. I did try to implement it in the game so that it has a movement animation, much like these objects, but the way the game animates objects is very confusing to figure out in the files, so I gave up trying that. For all I know though, this could be completely wrong. I have no clue what Rubtop intended to do with this. Not even sprites in the upcoming updates match the artistic choice of this skull, and it never came out in any update. The only theory I have for why it was not implemented is because of how different it is to everything else in the game. All other artistic choices and designs at the time felt like they were belonged in the same world, whereas this skull felt rather out of place. And to my knowledge, and for this video, this stands as the final piece of content that was left unused in Geometry Dash over the years. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.